We're going to start with Lord Adair in the middle of my group now, because, Lord Adair, you can give us the big picture, can't you, as an intro to this conversation. Where are we from a global perspective?
Well, I'm going to focus... Can everybody hear?
Yes, you can.
I'm going to focus primarily on the electricity system because that's what I'm going to talk about now. And the Energy Transition Commission, which I chair, which is a global commission, will produce in a couple of months' time a report on the progress and how we decarbonize electricity systems across the world. And I want to make 4 points which start with the global picture, but also some implications for the UK. The first is that it is absolutely possible to build cost-effective systems which are as much as 70% or more dependent on variable renewables, essentially wind and solar. Now, that doesn't mean one should be anti-nuclear. There may well be a significant role for nuclear and geothermal and hydro wherever you've got. But we are confident...
We're just struggling with the microphone slightly, Lord Adair. If you just bring it away from your mouth slightly. And, we've got a handheld coming up. The old-fashioned method.
Okay, I'll do that.
Thank you very much.
Okay, it doesn't mean you should be against nuclear or geothermal or hydro wherever you've got it, but we should have confidence that we can balance systems with high levels of VRE. Both in terms of, and I say this a bit carefully, the short-term second-by-second balance, and clearly we'll have to find out exactly what has happened in the Spanish and Portuguese system, and it may be that a lack of inertia contributed not to the problem that occurred, but to the speed at which it was put right. So we are going to have to make sure that grids with high levels of VRE have all sorts of synthetic inertia within them. But in terms of balancing the energy across the days, across the years, the periods of time when the wind doesn't blow and the sun doesn't shine, that is a manageable system. Point 2, however, it's much easier in the sun belt of the world than in the wind belt of the world. I don't think people have yet realized what a revolutionary combination solar plus batteries is going to be in the many parts of the world where the primary renewable resource is solar and where the fundamental balancing problem is diurnal, day to night, rather than seasonal. Across much of Latin America, Africa, Asia, India, Southeast Asia, solar plus batteries will be the killer app of the energy transition to a far greater extent and far cheaper than people have realized. And you can see that in the extraordinary low prices being bid in India for round-the-clock renewables, where the providers have to put combinations of solar and wind and batteries together and commit in an auction to provide electricity 80% or more of the hours of the year, and increasingly on what's called time-slotted commitments, where they're committing 24 hours in advance to do it even at the peak periods. All of that, by the way, raises an interesting question about whether the cheapest places to produce electricity in future are going to be in the Sun Belt, and does that mean we will import electricity from the Sun Belt, for instance from North Africa in interconnectors, or does it mean that in some energy-intensive industries may logically in future be based in the Sun Belt, not the Wind Belt? The third point is it is more challenging in the wind belt, which is the northern latitudes. Yes, we do have sun. We have lots of sun today. Indeed, right today, I just checked before I came in, we are getting 28% of our electricity right this hour from solar, but we're only getting 5% from wind. And that actually illustrates the biggest challenge in a place like Northern Europe, where our main resource will be wind most of the time, particularly in winter, but what to do when the wind goes down, not just overnight as the sun goes down in the middle of Africa, but sometimes for 2 or 3 weeks in the middle of winter. We are going to have to deploy a far wider set of storage technologies, hydrogen and pumped hydro and compressed air, as well as batteries. We think it is manageable, but it is more expensive. And by the way, the path to net zero on this will not be linear. Last year, the UK in the first quarter, our carbon intensity of electricity was 125 grams per kilowatt hour, down from 500 grams in 2010, so we'd achieved 75% of decarbonisation. But in the first quarter of this year, our carbon intensity actually went up because we had a less windy first quarter. And this is the challenge that Chris has to work what we're going to do about. Finally, therefore, three things which I think are particularly important in this environment that we face. First, the only way to get to a net zero economy is electrification plus decarbonisation, but we have to keep the electrification in line with the decarbonisation. If over the next 5 years all we do is decarbonise UK electricity, and if that costs some money and we're not using more electricity, that will increase the cost of electricity per kilowatt hour in a way that then undermines electrification. So I think we need a very strong focus on driving electrification as fast as possible so that we are amortizing the extra cost that we're putting into grids. The second point is demand-side flexibility. A lot of the costs in a renewable energy system are driven not by the average provision of electricity, but the provision at the peak. That is true of both generating assets and transmission and distribution grid assets. And we really have to get smart at time of day tariffs and encouraging both households and industries to use electricity when it is naturally in surplus supply and when there is not peak demand on the grid. And thirdly, we have to be really careful about what I call the last mile. Everything that we're doing in our analysis across the world suggests that the hardest bit of getting to absolute net zero is the last 50 grams per kilowatt hour. And so we have to be smart and intelligent about that. And if that means that our definition of net zero, and I think it is near net zero, and we get below 50 grams per kilowatt hour, once we get to that level, I would focus almost entirely on the electrification side of the story, and we can work out how to deal with the last 50 grams per kilowatt hour in another decade's time. Let's not get too religious about net zero. So those are some of the themes coming out of the global work that the ETC is doing. We will be coming out with analysis of how you do it in China, in India, in Spain, and in the UK as what we call archetypes, which then have relevance to different climate mixes across the world. Thank you.
Lord Turner, thank you very much indeed. Chris, when we first met, you'd just taken over at Mission Control some time ago. Can you explain a bit more of its purpose, but also the progress that you've been making?
Yeah, so can you hear me?
Can you hear Chris? No. Okay, let's hold the handhold.
Sorry, back to the handheld, always safer. Yes, it's coming up for 9 months, but it's about a year to the day when I took the phone call from Ed Miliband when he asked me if I would do this job. So I've been living with it for quite a while. And prior to that, of course, I had done work at the Climate Change Committee, something that Adair knows very well. He's helped set it up, to try and illustrate what it would mean to achieve a clean power mix and not to have that overly purist approach to it that Adair just talked about. So I came into this job fresh with all of that, and I don't feel we have wasted a single day, really, since we began. Quite simply, if we want to reach something as stretching as a clean power system by 2030, we've done the job of defining that. So we've defined it as 95% clean. So acknowledging the fact that we're in a very good position because we have such an extensive gas fleet to build on top of that with the renewable sources that Adair has just talked about. So 95% is our goal. We could also see the pipeline of projects that would deliver that. So we did a lot of work early to try and illustrate that. And we did some energy systems analysis with NESO, the energy systems operator, to try and illustrate the power mix that they felt they could operate by 2030. And the real kind of key, I suppose, in the first 6 months at least, was then to get out ahead of all of that and put a plan around it. So we published that plan just before Christmas. I don't mind telling you that my own personal capital in this job, we used a lot up in those early months just trying to get that plan out there because government's natural reaction is always to wait. There's always another spending review or another budget or another moment later in the year for you to publish something like that. I felt very, very sure that we needed to publish that plan so that you in industry could see what we were trying to do, because after all, we will only be able to shape what happens. It's ultimately delivered by a set of industries across the UK. And the real kind of secret sauce of this is not just to talk about, as we have in the plan, the goals that we have for 2030 framed around that energy system and analysis across the generation types. It's actually to go deeper than that, to talk about networks in particular. So we've also given our backing to a once-in-a-generation network build that will facilitate that power to move to the places it needs to from where it's being generated. We're essentially turning the British grid inside out to make that happen. The grid was planned around coal. It will be planned around wind when we finish that job by 2030. But the secret to make this work is that we also needed to reform the queue of connections that we have waiting to connect to the British grid. And that is probably the most radical thing that we've agreed to do. So if you want to do something really quickly, we have developers out there, many of them in this audience, who are as keen as mustard to deliver it. They are not in the right place in the queue to do that. So right now, as we speak, we've taken the very difficult decision to pause new connections, which is a very big step, so that we can reorder that queue across the country and put the projects that are most aligned with what we want to achieve by 2030, but also most ready to be developed and to be switched on, to be at the top of that queue. So later this year, we will have a full list of 2030 projects, all of them in line with the strategic objectives that we've laid out in our plan, ready to connect and ready to go much, much quicker. So the real secret here is that actually we want to facilitate that, make it happen more quickly. And this is absolutely the year when we need to clear the decks for that to happen. And we might also talk later in this about policies that will facilitate that. This is also the year where we need to clear the decks for big policies, big decisions around wholesale markets, big decisions about how we run the next set of renewables auctions, because we are right up against it if we want to move quickly on this, and we do want to move quickly on it. That word mission that we put around this is a real thing. We're trying very, 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 very hard to move as quickly as we possibly can to make that happen.
Okay, I'm going to come to Steve and the other Chris in a moment's time, but Chris, one more question for you. It's in terms of how private and public stakeholders are working with you and engaging more effectively.
So an admission, which you should never do in front of a big audience, but this term mission control is not one that I love. So the reason I don't love it is because I get lots of letters addressed to the mission controller, and that's definitely not how I feel about this job. But there is a logic behind it. The idea of having a sort of nerve centre for this is very much what Ed Miliband is trying to do, and I lead that, and I'm very happy to lead that. What that means is that we are also the point of contact across generation, storage and networks for those key projects. So I'm very careful and very happy to say this in front of this audience. Please make use of that. We want to know what stage your development is at. There are lots of tools at our disposal to try and accelerate these projects to get onto the grid as quickly as possible, and we're happy to use them. Okay,
let's get the view of the national grid then, and let's talk to Steve. What are your main priorities, Steve? What are your frustrations? How are things going? How is it working?
Thank you, and thank you for inviting me to speak. So look, we're at heart a networks company, so we're an enabler of all of this. As Chris and Adair have said, we will need much bigger electricity grids, transmission and distribution, because these new sources of power generation aren't where historically the coal and gas plants were. But also we're going to see a huge rise in demand as well as we electrify heat and transport. And then we may also see huge increases in demand from, AI and data centres. Sadly, building transmission lines in the past has been slow and painful, so typically that will take 9 to 10 years, of which only 1 to 2 years is actually construction. 7 or 8 years is the planning and consenting up front. So we've been working really hard with government to reduce the time it takes to get permission to build new lines. We've got an act going for the House at the moment. There was an amendment laid just last week that we think could take a year off that process up front. So there's a real opportunity to get the speed at which we build those lines down to, hopefully more like 3 to 4 years, which is what we'll need to do. Chris has already mentioned connections reform, so that's hugely important. And I think the reforms that were announced last week, so that we can actually prioritise the customers who want to connect to our network, that we need to go on first. And then the third thing, I mean, we are undertaking the biggest build out of the grid in 70 years. We've called it the Great Grid Upgrade. We raised £7 billion, which is the largest equity raise any company's done in the UK for many, many years, to fund what will be a £30 billion investment programme over the next 6 or 7 years. So there's a challenge for our regulators as well. We are not alone in trying to do that. Every other country, the US is trying to do the same, Europe is. So we need to make sure that the level of returns that we're offered through our regulatory regime are competitive with the terms that we can get elsewhere. We have a big US business, so I think Ofgem has got that message, and it's just really important that we think about how we support that level of investment, which is not something we've had to do in the past.
Thank you very much indeed. Chris, to you then, let's just catch up on E.ON's position in the market. How are you working with other energy transition collaborators? Is your experience also slow and painful?
I wouldn't characterise our experience as slow and painful at all. So I think a couple of things. So one, I think having clarity of mission around clean power and having a plan to deliver it, I wouldn't underestimate the strength of investment signal that delivers to the market, not just in terms of the things that Chris has mentioned, but also some of the adjacent work that we do. So I was with our parent yesterday in Dusseldorf. The fact, in essence, sorry, Freudian slip. So the fact that the UK is sticking to doubling down on and has clarity of mission on delivery of clean power is a really powerful investment signal in terms of the UK as a market to invest in versus perhaps some of the other markets in Europe in which we operate. So I absolutely wouldn't characterise it as slow and painful. I would like, though, to come back to a couple of the points that Adair made earlier. I think, and some of the other speakers made, the importance, we know that a decarbonised energy system ultimately is cheaper for the economy, ultimately is cheaper for consumers. The question is, how do we get from where we are today to there? And how do we get from where we are today to there in a way which delivers real benefits for people most quickly? And I think the points that Adair made in terms of really focusing on electrification, really unlocking the value that demand-side flexibility, that consumer flexibility can provide, both in terms of the overall system cost, but also in terms of meaningful, tangible bill reductions for residential customers, for businesses in the UK. If I'd like to see one thing perhaps a little bit different, it's a greater prioritisation, a equivalent focus on the electrification of consumption as production. It's the equivalent focus on demand-side flexibility and unlocking the benefits of that for customers as we see in the system itself.
And it's great that you talk about the customer front and centre. Clearly that's something that, Lord Adair, you want to build on. If you could pass the microphone once again to Lord Adair.
On what?
On the consumer.
Yes, look, the consumer issue is crucial. Our analysis and the CCC's analysis and everybody's analysis, and Chris has just said it, shows that once we go through a transition, it's clear that renewable-dominated and zero-carbon systems can be lower cost for the consumer than the fossil fuel-based system. I've got absolutely no doubt. But we go through a transition period where some of the initial subsidies that we had to put in place to get this process rolling are still in the system. They are legacy charges. In the UK, we have chosen to put all of the early costs of the transition on the electricity bill rather than the gas bill, and that has kept the electricity to gas price ratio high. That high electricity to gas price ratio is a disincentive to people to invest in heat pumps, which is one of the crucial ways that we should be driving electrification of residential heat. And let's be clear, at the moment, when I was at the CCC in our original period, we talked about UK electricity demand going from 330 terawatt hours to 600 or more by 2050. 15 years later, it's actually come down a bit. We haven't really started the electrification that we need. So getting this balance right and really trying to work out what can we do, not just 30 years out, not just in the promise, which is undoubtedly there, of lower bills in the future, but how do we make sure that early on we are actually giving people lower bills? And I think demand-side flexibility is one of these crucial ones, really helping to communicate to people that if they do intelligent things about when they consume electricity, moving it away from the peak, that they can then tap into the benefits of the fact that renewables are by definition cheaper when they're actually running rather than necessarily at peak demand. So I do think this focus on how do we turn the long-term promise of lower electricity bills into actual visibility sooner rather than later is crucial to deliver both the economic benefits and to achieve the political support for the transition that we're trying to make.
Okay, thank you. Lots of questions coming in. Thank you very much indeed to those of you who are engaging on Slido. Chris, maybe this is one for you. What can be done to get the UK government to take a long-term approach as Temasek, is that how we pronounce it, in Singapore does?
Well, I think that the important thing to say is, although I'm very focused on 2030, the only reason I'm very focused on 2030 is because it's stage one of a longer-term plan, and we've got to have that viewpoint that the world does not end in 2030. And the reason I'm so keen on cleaning up the power system quickly over the next 5 years or so is because of the new demand for electricity that's coming after 2030. So I don't expect that we will see much change overall in demand for electricity, although there is a lot of uncertainty about that. Things like data centres could very well upset that viewpoint. But even factoring in the transition to electric vehicles, which is happening at a pace now, this is a period when we can invest, at least on the supply side, to develop the cleaner energy sources that we need for 2030 and beyond. Because after 2030, we might well double the size of the power system as we move to electrifying end uses. Presently, we use fossil fuels. So the long-term view is there. I would say that if you think of the 2030 plan as stage one of that, we are absolutely following the right strategy, and I say that confidently because it's something that I spent 7 years at the CCC advising on, and in prior years before that, organisations like the CCC and others have been advising that we do exactly what we're doing now. So it is a hard push, but it is not, funnily enough, a short-term strategy. It's simply stage one of a longer-term plan which we need to pursue as a country and which other countries around the world will have to pursue as well. I'll leave you with one warning on this question, because if we don't do what we're doing on clean power now, the only answer to managing that future demand increase will be gas. So we will lock in, because it's quick to build a gas-fired power station, we will end up locking in for another generation a source of energy that has caused us an immense amount of misery and pain over the last few years and in prior cycles before it. So part of this is not actually about decarbonisation at all. It's about insulating ourselves from the next price spike. And those price spikes, as everyone in this audience knows, are not something that we can manage in this country alone. So this is a very sensible strategy for all sorts of reasons, not just for reasons of net zero, but also for energy security, national security, and I would say for the consumer too, although I accept entirely that the challenge of bringing home the consumer benefits early is going to be the critical success factor.
Okay, let's pass the mic back to Chris and Steve now to look at the investment opportunities and challenges with 2030 only being 5 years away. What can be done, would you say, to scale technologies and infrastructure?
So it's a really important point. I think the way we think about it, if we built networks the way we had historically, we'd never hit the timelines and they'd be way too expensive. So I'm very fortunate to run National Grid's corporate venture capital fund based out of Silicon Valley. There are a whole slew of technologies coming through that we need to get on our grids, from new software to new hardware that can work our existing grids harder. So there are a bunch of technologies called grid enhancing technologies that mean that essentially and simply you can maybe get 20 to 30% more capacity out of your existing system. So hugely important we do that, both to manage affordability for customers, but also, let's be honest, new transmission lines aren't popular, so it's really important that people believe that we are doing everything we can with the system we've got before we ask them, can we actually build new lines. So I think, again, it comes back to government and regulation. Historically, we've said all the right things about innovation. We haven't always been as good at taking these new technologies and deploying them rapidly. So my big thing is, how do we make sure that we don't build the grid of the past as we rush to build out for 2030, but how do we both improve the grid we've got, but also build, using these new technologies. And it's not just software, it's hardware as well. There are new technologies even on, the pylons and the lines that you construct. So I think that's the big challenge for all of us collectively, is to make sure that we look to the future and not to the past.
Yeah, and I think with the world of energy tech and the world of energy innovation, particularly here in the UK, is just, I'm sure in this venue today, it's really exciting. If with the right policy landscape, the right policy certainty, which I think we're getting now in the UK, with the right regulatory environment, then the opportunity to scale both some of the physical and digital technologies, which will ultimately deliver some of the benefits that we've been talking about, is huge. I mean, we also have a venture fund that we participate in. We participate in the Free Electrons program. I look at some of the technologies that we've been bringing to the UK. A behind-the-meter energy community solution to equitably share solar output in apartment blocks. I look at some of the digital technology with the partnership that we have with an Australian business, Amber, which allows individual homes to be optimized, those homes to participate directly in the energy market. So not a VPP model, direct participation in energy markets, which, when we look at what it does for customers in Australia, brings bills down significantly, or sometimes to the point where energy becomes an income. That's those type of digital and physical technologies, I'm hugely excited about. We're starting to get the policy certainty, starting to get the clarity of mission. We need the right regulatory environment, and I'm really optimistic about what we can do.
Thank you very much. Another question from Slido, and I'm being inundated now, which is fantastic. Chris, this is a question for you, and I remember asking this to you when you first took over your job, which is, what are the 2 to 3 things that you can do to ensure that we can bring people, consumers, customers on this journey? At the moment, this is a very self-selecting audience. It's about communication. How do you communicate the message?
Yeah, I mean, it's something I care deeply about. I mean, I felt particularly when I was leading the Climate Change Committee that it was very, very important to go out and speak to people who you don't agree with about what is going on. And I had a wonderful experience a few years ago now with a process that was arranged actually by Parliament, the select committees in Parliament, with a group of 100 and so very carefully selected to be representative of the population, group of voters, over several weekends while we talked through the implications of net zero. And it was a wonderful experience because, of course, they're very sensible people. So they have various views. There are people who love nuclear power, there are people who hate nuclear power, and they all collectively came to an agreement about what they thought they would like to see happen for net zero. The reason I tell you that story is because I feel we need to do the same with this. I think whether it's an organised process like that or not, we can't just pretend that this is something that we're going to do in rooms like this or in rooms with developers only, dealing only with big industry and big money. People are worried about this, and I think part of this is about assuaging some of those fears, because it's not something that people should worry about, would be my take on it, and I think we should have a go at explaining that to people. We also have to absolutely tackle this idea that somehow we're going to carpet the country with infrastructure. We're not at all. I think it's really important that we're clear about what's happening. We're very clear about those communities that will be impacted, clear about the impacts there and how we're going to manage them, but also address the populace at large about what we're doing here. This is not some mad bad eco vision of what we're doing here. This is a very sensible energy strategy that we're pursuing. We're catching up for lost time. In decades prior, we could have moved quicker, and it's always been my position that we should have as well. So I think we should be able to tell that story more directly to people, but also have people influence what we do. And it's not just a sort of broadcast. Now, I think this year, inevitably, we are going to be spending a lot of time thinking about big policies, big developments, big infrastructure. But as this progresses over the course of this year and into the remainder of this Parliament, that is something I hope that we'll do a lot more of. And that's one of the reasons I wanted to do this job, because it's something I take a lot from, actually. I'd like to lead some of that if I can.
Okay, Lord Turner, perhaps you could build on that. How do we assuage, or you, the industry, assuage public fears and communicate what is essentially really quite complex information so that customers actually feel like they own the answers?
Well, Chris was talking there, I was thinking actually back to a completely different issue where I chaired the Pensions Commission back in 2006, which ended up with a significant increase in the UK state pension age. And at a crucial point, as we were trying to create cross-party support and public support, we actually held 3 sets of town halls where we had 250 people in 4 different locations connected by video for 4 hours, in which we talked about the challenges that we faced, the options that were faced in a pension system, and we began by asking people what policies they wanted, and the majority voted for a completely inconsistent set of policies. They didn't want any increase in the retirement age, they didn't want any increase in income or national insurance, and they wanted the state pension linked to average earnings. And we basically said, well, that's all very nice to like that, but you can't have it. And we went through a process, and by the end of the day, you ended up with coherent public policy choices. So I think some of these sort of big involvement things are crucial, but I think the other point is really bringing out some of the other points that have been made. This point about removing our vulnerability to the gas price, right? It is ultimately the gas price that drives sudden and extremely hurtful peaks in the electricity price to individuals. And we've got to explain and help understand and honestly describe what we have to do to get there, but we will get to a system where people will have just much greater consistency and predictability in their electricity charges. So it's a combination of engaging with people, listening to them, but also clearly setting out the crucial elements of the argument which are relevant to individuals. If I can just say one of the things, I think Steve's point about new grid technologies is really exciting, and this piece of work that we're about to produce, we have a focus on that, and I didn't know about them till I did them, but there are lots and lots of things we can do to make existing grids or new grids much more efficient in terms of the amount of electricity that they can carry per pylon per line. So we've really got to make sure that we are investing in that so that we are not, unnecessarily building physically intrusive infrastructure. We will have to do some of that, but we're keeping it to a minimum because we're really being as smart as possible with the technologies.
Chris and Steve, is it an issue of efficiency?
I think it's a huge challenge on all of us because, we know that energy bills are high. We know that, the macroeconomic context is not great. So we've just got to constantly find ways to do things, cheaper, faster and better. And that's always easy to say, but like Adair, I'm optimistic because I see the cutting edge of technology, and there are these huge tailwinds coming through with some of the things we're seeing. I think on the point of customer and transition, I think there's also a point about honesty. I always give the example. I moved to an electric vehicle about 5 years ago, and it is different. Now that may change with super fast charging and some of what's come through, but just getting people to experience it. And some of those changes are actually positive. The fact that you do need to charge your car sort of moves you away from being obsessed with getting from A to B as quickly as possible, and probably makes you a patient and safer driver because you kind of accept that you need to factor that in. And as I said, when I first got my car, my partner thought I was mad, and she was like, this is a crazy idea. And when it came to the end of the lease at 3 years and I said, what are we going to do? She said, well, we're not getting anything other than an electric vehicle. But she had to experience and go through it to get there. So I think giving customers that honesty that it's different, but then allowing them to experience it's an important part of the journey.
Yeah, I mean, we have, round numbers, 40 million customers around Europe, so across Europe. So, to the points that have been made earlier, I think if we asked them, at one level, you'd get 40 million different answers in terms of what people want to see. But what all of our customers uniformly tell us is that they want energy to be simple, easy to understand, affordable, and contrary to what you might see in what we might see in the press sometimes, they absolutely do want it to be green. And if I take those three things, and the points that we've touched on already, yes, the engagement matters. Yes, how we have an honest conversation with people matters. But equally, ultimately, what people want is to feel that they benefit from and have a stake in the energy transition. And so therefore, I think there's probably a couple of things in the UK that may be missing that we see in other markets, which is you can see an end state where energy is abundant and cheaper for everybody. But in terms of, we know that we need to invest in the grid, we know that we need to invest in the transmission and distribution network, and that there is a cost to that. So therefore, I think what we need is a bridging mechanism. The UK is one of the only markets in Western Europe without real targeted price protection for those people in fuel poverty who are struggling, be that a social tariff or other forms of targeted price protection. We're quite unique in not having that. And then secondly, I think the thing that I see in other markets that we operate in, where we're under-indexed in the UK, is operating, is really engaging and operating and delivering energy infrastructure at a city, at a municipality, at a community level. I see that in, scale in Scandinavia and in Germany. We're starting to do that with the strategic energy partnership that we've got, for example, with the city of Coventry. But investing in energy and energy infrastructure at a community level, I think really then starts to help engage people and help people benefit and see that their community benefits from the energy transition. So I think bridging mechanism, more focus on cities and communities, as well as the engagement that's been described.
Thank you very much. We're reaching the end of our session. If you could pass the microphone back down to Steve, please, Lord Turner, because we have a room full of influencers here. And I am going to ask each of you to spend a minute and a half or so talking about a key message that you'd like us all to take away. What is your call to action to each one of us when we leave the room this afternoon?
So I think it is about getting involved and thinking about the role that you can play. So I've talked about the grid infrastructure we need to build. We're going to need people. The media and social media and everything will always focus on those people who oppose that. Areas where we're trying to build at the moment. You'll see the signs and the campaigns up. I think one of my favourite headlines of the last few years was the Economies magazine that had on the front cover, if you believe in the transition, hug a pylon, not a tree. And we do need people in this room to accept and to be making that positive case for some of the infrastructure. As Chris said, we are not going to destroy this green and present land with millions of pylons. It will be targeted, et cetera, et cetera. But actually having people out there who try and explain and why we need to do this, why it's important, is really helpful to build, or really important to building that public acceptance of what needs to happen.
Thank you very much, Steve. Chris?
Firstly, it's in all of the talk of systems, of costs, of affordability, of infrastructure, of investment, we must remember that there is an imperative to decarbonise, that for my children, for our children, our grandchildren, there is an imperative to decarbonise. I think in terms of the question is how we get there, and for me, electrification of consumption, really drive the electrification, the innovation, the technology that will rapidly increase the adoption of electricity as the primary form of heating, the primary energy of the future. And then secondly, the technologies, the innovation that will enable all consumers, not just the affluent few, all consumers of electricity to realise the value that their consumption has by being able to shift when they consume, how they consume, and in many cases also be able to generate and provide electricity back to the system.
Thank you. Lord Turner.
Well, building on what Chris said, I do think it is important to win the climate-based case for decarbonisation. I think we sometimes end up saying, oh, well, these new technologies, they're so wonderful, they're so much cheaper that we do it even if there wasn't a climate case. I'm a little bit wary of that. There will be costs in transition. That is not a costless transition. All the polling suggests that the vast majority of people do buy Chris's argument that we should be doing things for our grandchildren to make sure that they've got a world worth living in. And we should build on that. We have to convince people, because it's absolutely right, that the transition costs are, in the total scheme of things, pretty small, and that once we've gone through the transition, in most sectors of the economy, there will be lower costs, but we need to be honest about the costs where there are. Secondly, we need to create a sense of excitement about what is possible on electrification. Electricity is the great technology. It is completely silent, it is completely pollutionless at the point of sale. Our cities will be much nicer when they've been deeply electrified. Most people who have got an electric vehicle could not imagine going back to those sort of noisy, rather smelly things called internal combustion engines. And by the way, they accelerate much more. If you're one of the guys who's a real sort of, car person and you need another argument, get your electric vehicle at the front of, the lights, next to the guy in the Porsche going, and you'll set off far faster off from the lights. I mean, if that's what gets you, I'll use that argument as well. But we've got to create a sense of excitement of what's possible, and then we've really got to focus as policymakers and on industry on how do we make the transition costs as small as possible, in particular for individual consumers, including addressing, and you mentioned the issue of social tariffs, the distributional issues, because the impact of this is very different between different consumers with different ability to invest in heat pumps. We need to take very seriously the fact that the impact does vary household by household and find ways around that challenge.
Thank you very much. Chris.
Lots to build on there. I mean, the sort of message that I'd want to leave you with is this. Look, we are completely committed to this thing for 2030. It goes right to the top, right to the Prime Minister, through the Chancellor, and out into industry. So this is a really unique moment for us. It's a great privilege to do a job like mine. We're trying to do something quite unusual. So we have laid out our ambitions early. They are, by design, at the very edge of what we think is possible. So it is literally a mission. But my main message to you is suspend your cynicism. We are going to do this. And we are a country that is often very cynical. I am from Glasgow in the west of Scotland. I'll tell you, we are extremely cynical. This is a moment where you should have optimism that we are going to support this. So I want you all to leave this room feeling that we are trying to do something worthwhile here. The benefits are enormous, you've heard already on this platform. But we are going to brigade the policies and the regulations in such a way that we deliver as much of this as we possibly can. Everyone in this room and beyond this in this country will benefit from that. And this is a moment not to be cynical, but instead to be optimistic.
Okay, well, we're very grateful for the views that you've shared with us, for giving us a sense of optimism and hope that we are actually on the right journey. Thank you very much. If I could ask you to give a big round of applause, please, to Steve, to Chris, Lord Turner, and also the second Chris. And may I thank all of you for your engagement through Slido. I'm so sorry that I wasn't able to incorporate more of your questions, but they were very interesting, and we'll see if we can get to them round the back at some point later on. But thank you very much indeed. Gentlemen, thank you.